Ron, you had a question?
I understand, Ron, that you're sort of suggesting that to produce an anxiety disorder, you need a combination of interaction between the anxious VI temperament
Right.
and attention control.
That's right.
Do you have any indication that it's the kids who have that combination earlier on that later on develop the disorder?
Right. So there's a reason that my forehead is flat. And the reason is that when you do a longitudinal study and you should have measured something earlier in the kids, you go like this. And you hit yourself in the head and you say, my goodness, if only we had measured error monitoring and attention bias when the children were younger, we could have addressed just the question that you're raising. Fortunately for us, NIH was kind enough to give us funds to start a new cohort of kids who are currently 7, selected the same way and run the same way as you saw for this earlier cohort. And now at 7, we're giving them the dot probe and the flanker task to look at their response monitoring and their attention bias, with the intention, hopefully, if they give us, if my hair doesn't get too gray and they continue to give us funding, to see whether or not we can ask and address just that longitudinal question. But I don't know. I can't answer the question from from this cohorts of data. Yeah.
Very interesting talk. You talked the work that you presented here really seems to be on this very rapid, orienting to the threat, very kind of lower level processing.
Right.
If I'm understanding correctly. Earlier though, you talked about the role of prefrontal areas in terms of kind of dampening down and activating parasympathetic functioning. I guess a couple of things. One is, what is the role then in terms of anxiety and misperceiving threats? And also, what about dampening down? Does that involve more kind of higher order processing and considering the situation? How does that fit?
Right. So those are really good questions. Let me answer. I don't know if I'll address them satisfactorily, but let me answer them 2 ways. The first is that with regard to this rapid orienting, the fact that you get this rapid orienting and that it's probably amygdala based in no way contradicts or the fact that you can also get very rapid response from ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So when we measure, for example, the ERP to the faces that are presented in the dot probe, we get ERPs which are in response to the threat, and then ERPs which are 100 milliseconds later that we think are actually emerging from the activity of ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So in terms of the timing, we can't say for sure, but I don't think that the dampening down from ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is necessarily necessarily has to be a much later process. That said, I always like touting my graduate students. That said, the question of the relation between this early attentional process and later attention components is a critical one to solve if you're thinking about the development of anxious behavior and anxiety. And so, for example, one of the things that we found and others have reported is that children who are socially withdrawn and behaviorally inhibited have negative attribution biases. And so a graduate student of mine actually has some really provocative data in which she has trained this attention bias, again using this training procedure, in non-anxious, these are in undergraduates, in non-anxious undergraduates, but she's trained them to bias the threat, and she's looked pre-post at attribution bias. And she's found that attribution bias has changed as a function of the training. So for those subjects who showed enhanced attention bias to threat, they actually showed more negative attribution bias post as opposed to pre. So I actually think that what we've identified is a very early aspect of attention that has cascading influences down the flow or pathway of information in terms of higher order processes as well. It's not to say that it's the be-all and end-all for all of that, but I think that it does have could have a significant effect.